right, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Mental Health and Engineering webinar. My name is Shivani Nathu. I am a Power System Planning Analyst at the ISO, and I'm also a member of OSPE's Diversity and Inclusion Task Force, and I'll be your moderator for tonight's panel. Please note that there is a closed captioning feature that you can enable by clicking on the three dots on your bottom navigation menu. Please submit all your questions via the question and answer feature on your right-hand menu. All questions will be answered at the end of the discussion during the question and answer portion of the event. We will also be posting a list of resources in the chat, such as general information resources and crisis hotlines, should you want to learn more or speak to someone during or after the event. Before we begin, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are coming to you from Toronto, which is in the dish with one spoon territory. We respectfully acknowledge the past and present traditional owners of this territory and their unique role in the life of this region. Toronto is on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. As settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and play in this territory. I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the awful news that we've heard coming out of Saskatchewan, British Columbia, and across Canada regarding the unmarked graves that have been found at residential schools. As settlers, it's important that we remember that colonialism has had lasting impacts on our society and that the journey to reconciliation will take all of us. I would also like to extend a special thank you to the University of Toronto and Spin Master for making this event possible today. As a profession, engineering is characterized by its rigor, emphasis on productivity, resiliency, and hard work. Only in recent years, after seeing the impact of this on engineering students and graduates, have institutions begun to shift their narrative to include an emphasis on mental health. Many employers, educators, and leaders are looking at how to support their staff and students through difficult times. I think we can all agree that this is a very timely discussion. As the world has experienced the isolation, grief, anxiety, and other impacts of a global pandemic, the focus on mental health has grown. Many of us have also started doom scrolling or paying attention to the news cycles more, which also has an impact on our mental health. June is a very special month as we celebrate Pride, Juneteenth, and Indigenous Peoples Day, and National Indigenous History Month. This past month has also been a particularly hard one for members of equity-seeking communities in Canada, as we have seen, as I mentioned earlier, the discovery of hundreds of unmarked graves at residential schools across the country. We've witnessed a horrific Islamophobic attack in London and a homophobic attack in Toronto. What may seem like a headline to one person can be very triggering for another, and we must be cognizant that recent events and difficult news cycles impact everyone differently and can drastically contribute to declines in mental health, especially for those who already feel like they don't belong or that they're not wanted. While we are not mental health experts, today's fantastic panelists will share their experiences as leaders, as individuals looking to destigmatize mental health conversations in the engineering space. Without further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to our panelists to introduce themselves and begin today's discussion. Laura, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thanks Shivani. My name is Laura Milsom. I work with Modern Niagara. I'm their Director of People and Culture. Before that, I grew up professionally in the public service, working for the City of Ottawa and then the Ottawa Police Service and then the federal government. However, for the last 4 years, I have been with Modern, learning the construction industry and the people who work within it. I am really delighted to be here. As you say, I'm not a mental health professional for sure. I'm a human resources professional, but a lot of our work, especially over the last year and a half, has been focused on supporting people who are struggling with a variety of issues in our society, from COVID to the things that you mentioned coming into this that are really difficult. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you for asking me, and I will pass it to my next panel.
And next will be Herman.
Hi, my name is Herman Chan, and I'm the Director of Product Development in Spin Master. And I've been in this company for about 10 years. So a lot of my experience in this has come from through the years I've been here and the people that I'm dealing with. Just like what Laura was saying, and also Shivani introduced, I'm also not an expert in mental health, but I'm happy to learn along with everyone, and I'm happy to share any thoughts that I have on this topic. So it's delighted to be here today. Really looking forward to the discussions coming up.
Thank you. And lastly, Allison.
Yeah, thank you, Shivani. Thanks for that really important opening as well. So my name is Allison Olioski. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto in mechanical engineering. You probably know, as a professor, every year I teach about 400 undergraduate students. So I see just a lot of young people. I see their successes, and sometimes I see their struggles. But also, what you may not know is that as a professor, you act almost like a mini CEO of a startup. So I have about 10 students who work with me doing research, my team, grad students and undergrads who I work with every day, and do my best to try to role model and encourage them to bring their best selves to work, their full selves to work. So I'm excited to speak on the panel tonight as well.
Great. Thank you. So I guess we'll get started with our first question. Laura, we'll start with you because this is related to workplaces. So what do you think are some of the barriers to improving mental health in the workplace and in institutions?
Yeah, I have been giving this a lot of thought, and especially with respect to our audience today. And I think the first one I come back to always is the stigma. And, you know, even with the people who manage to get pushed through that stigma and reach out, it still weighs heavy. What is the impact going to be on my career? Do people think that it's affecting my performance? Is it something as a piece of baggage that's going to follow me around? And that can be really overwhelming, especially if you're new in your career and you're just starting out, and that's maybe not the foot you feel like you want to start off on. I think the way that we look at mental health really reinforces the stigma in a lot of ways, and that we see it as a dichotomy. Either you're well or unwell, rather than a continuum that actually is really where we live, generally moving up and down, sometimes daily on that continuum. And then I think if I could maybe share a third one, if we do manage to punch through those two first barriers, a lot of the times managers don't necessarily know how to respond to an employee who comes to them sharing a mental health struggle or a struggle in that area of their life. So I think those three things make it really difficult for both employees and managers to find their way to a productive and helpful conversation.
That's a very thoughtful answer. Herman and Allison, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think, that particular point about how, like, you're not just well or unwell, like you're somewhere, it could be somewhere in between on a daily basis. I think that's like a big part of what I recognize as well, is at any given point, based on the events that you've been experiencing, people that you know, and stuff like that, it could affect you very differently, right? And as a leader, you really need to recognize that and be highly aware of that. So you just can't make too much assumptions or paint situation too broad a brush, right?
Yeah, for sure. Allison, do you have any thoughts on this, especially with the lens of a school and university environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Herman touched on it right at the end there, which is that in addition to there being a stigma around this topic, I think we all also have assumptions about it. What a person who's struggling actually looks like, how people might be open to or not open to seeking help. And I've learned in managing like a very wonderfully diverse group of students that there's different cultural barriers, people's family experience. You know, maybe you had a family that was pretty open to talking about emotional ups and downs, or where you talk about, you know, going to a therapist like you talk about going to a doctor, but in other families you don't talk about it at all. And so I think, yeah, in the student perspective, a lot of these students are away from home for the first time and sort of trying to figure out what is the struggle that they need help with and what is the struggle that is just changes in their lives.
And I think one of the things you mentioned there about the different cultures across, students' backgrounds. Laura, you also mentioned too that managers may not know how to respond. And I think one of the other barriers that is coming up in all of these themes is language too. Like they don't necessarily know how to speak about it, how to talk about these issues. Some people may overreact, some person might just need a day off, but then they get placed on leave. So those are some of the things I think that are coming up in everyone's minds, but those are really great points. Continuing on the topic of culture, how do you think that the culture of engineering itself contributes to mental health decline? And as leaders or individuals, what can we do to change this? And I'll start with you, Allison.
Yeah, sure. Well, I might start by stereotyping a bit here, but I think that's where I'll start. Of course, there's exceptions. As engineers, I think there's a bunch of things about our culture that really does start at university. So I was a Queen's Sci 1.0 graduate and felt very much part of the Queen's University culture at the time. But when I think back, I realized that, there's many of the stories that we're proud of about engineering, or we were in the past, had to do with how tough things were, sort of like stories of suffering through. Even if you're a graduate student, you maybe have qualifying exams and they're hard for you because they were hard for me when I was a student. And then, a lot of us also pick engineering because we love math and physics, and maybe we don't love topics that have to do with humanity as much. Again, that's a really big stereotype. But when I think back to my undergraduate experience, maybe the closest in class that I got to talking about humans was like the microeconomics class that I took. We don't really talk about the irrationality of humans. And of course, we're super irrational in many ways. So that's, I think that's a starting point. Speaking of vocabulary, Shivani, like we don't necessarily know even how to talk about these things. A lot of other people take an intro to psych course. We don't even know that part of things. And then, finally, I think a lot of us, to get into tough engineering programs, we were overachievers. We did really well in school. Maybe we've seen a lot of successes in our lives, and that can be then really tough. And maybe we haven't developed the coping mechanisms that we need when we hit inevitable blocks in the road. We don't know how to reach out. We don't know that it could be normal. So yeah, I'd say I think there's a stigma and there are barriers in every profession, but those are maybe some that might crop up more in engineering.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I noticed a lot at school is that, especially in recent years, the cutoff marks, or like the marks to get into engineering, are so high that the students who have those marks have never failed at anything. So once you start facing failure, people don't know how to react. You have imposter syndrome. Everyone's a perfectionist, and that's not good for mental health. So those are really great points. Herman, how do you see that the culture of engineering contributes to mental health decline? And as a leader, what are some of the things that you've been doing or think you can do to change this?
I think like you were talking about, everybody is like a perfectionist in this profession, and yeah, it is a little bit stereotyping. It's also like it also goes with everybody's so like solution oriented in a way. It's almost like the part of your lifestyle, your job description. Everybody's looking for something to resolve, right? So when it comes to like something like mental health, there might not be an obvious solution, and there might not be any solution, and that, I think that in a way shies a lot of people away from it, because they know that it's a puzzle that can't really be solved in a clear way. So I think that's definitely what's causing it as well, as part of the culture, right? And I think as a leader, what I try to do is to make sure that I am showing that it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to to have to discuss about these things with whoever you're comfortable with. And it's okay to recognize it. Is to try to break down the stigma as much as possible. That's what I try to do as a leader.
No, I think that's a really great point, especially when people are looking for role models and knowing that they can be vulnerable, it just means a lot because they're not afraid of opening up, right? And one of the things, one of the themes that is talked about when you become a graduating engineer and you're going through the ritual of the calling of engineer, I won't say what happens because I'm not allowed to, but one of the themes of that event is really failure and knowing that the materials and everything has a breaking point, and to focus and rely on others, especially as a junior, rely on your seniors to help you fix those mistakes. And I think that's something that really gets lost in the workforce when people enter, even though it's told to us right before we graduate. But I think that's a really good point, just reminding people that they're allowed to fail. Laura, do you have anything to add to that?
I think the only thing is maybe just to double down on the points, and that, I think sometimes the perception is that asking for help is the failure, rather than, if we are self-aware enough to know that we're struggling on the physical front, no one is like, why would you ask a doctor for help? That's weird. They'd be like, great, you took control. And I think, starting to think about asking for help, especially in the mental health domain, is to really see it as an act of courage and self-awareness. To take control of a situation that might feel like it is spinning out of control, and asking for that help is really the best way to be successful, right? And so I think it's really reframing it a little bit to think of it as a success. I think that's how you take care of yourself. That's how you take care of your work, and it's how you take care of your team at work too.
I think one thing that I know can be difficult for junior engineers when entering the workforce is asking for help in general.
Yeah.
Even if it's like, on a project, you might not want to seem like you don't know what you're doing to your seniors. And so I think just creating a culture and letting people know that they can ask for help, and they should ask for help when they don't know what's going on, because if not, the project could go sideways later on if they do something wrong. So I think
if you're on a bit of an angle, then asking for help at the beginning, that's great. Asking for help when you're 3 million lost, not as great.
And I think that also helps with improving the culture just of vulnerability and, knowing that we're humans as opposed to robots.
Another leader and I often do lunch and learns on mental health, and we do try and normalize the talk of having a therapist, calling the EAP program. That's just a normal part of being a human at work under really difficult conditions.
Yeah, and I think one good thing that's come out of this past year is that a lot of employers have really pushed their EAP programs and pushed all of the supports to the employees, because COVID's been very hard. And so a lot of that's been kind of normalized. Relating to that, what can we do to encourage employees and students to be authentic and speak up when facing difficulties? And how do we continue to normalize those conversations of mental health? I'll start with you, Herman.
Yeah, I think it's these points are kind of like one leading on the other, right? It's like it is just to make sure that everybody feels welcome to have that conversation. And it's important also to know that, like, as someone who's not a mental health expert, like we don't necessarily need to provide any input or anything. Sometimes, just to invite someone to express, so that you can listen on it, sometimes that helps. And then also letting people know that, like, you also experience things like this, where it's to show by example that it's okay to have that struggle sometimes. And that's and then referring them to the professional help that Laura was just mentioning about, and then I think all about it, whether school or employer will have those services, those assistance services and stuff like that, to make sure that those resources are easily found, and they know where to go for those when they're ready to. I think that's important.
Great. Allison, do you have anything to add to this? And I think particularly one of the things that we've talked about before is, the Identify, Assist, Refer program that U of T has, just in giving leaders the tools to kind of have these conversations. So I don't know if you want to touch on that or anything else you think.
Yeah, lots of stuff. So maybe I'll talk a bunch and then you can come back to me.
Yeah.
One thing, so Herman mentioned earlier, like, engineers tend to be solution oriented. And it did make me think about how earlier this year, for example, we had like a crisis, a mental health crisis at the University of Toronto in my immediate group, and it was a really tough time. And a great thing now about universities is they're coming around to recognize the seriousness of mental health and the requirements of like real structural support. So I was able to reach out to a mental health programs officer and an incident coordinator at the university. Actually, I didn't reach out to them. I felt open enough to ask my boss, the chair of the department, and he reached out to them. And I really like tried to get, all my students the help that they needed, and tried to normalize going to therapy and normalize talking about things in front of them. And like, I have a great supportive partner and family, and I felt like I was supported. But then I did take a step back and think like, I'm talking about this essentially EFAP program so much, yet I haven't taken advantage of it. Like, what's holding me back from taking advantage of it? And so I decided to do it, to call myself, and it was like surprisingly scary to do it. I felt like, oh, I'm going to call, I'm a burden, because, it's just me reacting to a crisis. It's not my crisis. But to speak to someone there immediately, same day, who of course is an expert and knows what trauma response looks like, is really valuable, and really helped kind of remind me that you got to take care of yourself to take care of other people too. So for me, that was like a really valuable experience, and reminded me, like, I think as leaders, we tend to get this adrenaline rush sometimes and try to get like, keep track of all of our team. And it's important to also then go back in and check in on yourself, because you can't sustain it yourself either. So all of that is to say that I think that even since I was in undergrad, I think universities are really beginning to step up their resources. I think it's in response to some great advocacy, like to Shivani's horn in 2018 or 19, Shivani, I don't know, you were part of a group at the University of Toronto that wrote a report saying we need some changes, we need some more advising and some more student support. And then the university has made some changes, like now there's a fall reading week, they hired these support staff, and there's still more that needs to be done, but it's certainly a topic of discussion on campus. And so your newly hired engineers will be, I think, better equipped to talk about these things, and they may actually expect more support.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think we're seeing a lot, especially with Naomi Osaka recently, pulling out of the French Open and saying, you know what, this is like, I'm prioritizing my mental health. I think a lot of people in the younger generation are coming to terms with all of this, and they're starting to demand it from their employers. So I think there's a push from both ends. And depending on who the group is, one is trying to catch up with the other. Laura, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I like the modeling the right behavior, or not the right behavior, but behavior that's inclusive of how everybody is feeling. Because in conversations I have with individuals, they are trying to do this, as Allison spoke about earlier, is they are suffering in certain ways, but also trying to protect their life so that there's no sacrifice that has to be made, right? I'm not going to go on leave. I'm not going to, and so trying to maintain that all is just a really heavy lift, and really doesn't help in the long run. And so, this acknowledgement of if I need to stop and take care of myself, that's the right thing for me. We always try and assure that, like, your job is here when you come back. This is, if you had a physical situation you needed to take care of, your job would still be here when you come back. It's this exact same thing to us. Because actually that's, from a kind of a crass employer position, you're going to come back a much better, more productive, happier, engaged employee, right? You don't need to suffer and struggle through. In fact, it's better for everybody if you don't try and do that to yourself.
I think, Laura, you had said this analogy in our previous discussion that we had about the sprained ankle or broken ankle. I don't know if you could go into that too, because I think one of the worries is that people don't they're afraid of speaking up because they don't want to be placed on leave. You know, in universities, there's some universities like the University of Toronto has recently created the mandated leave policy. And so there's a lot of fear around that. But I was just hoping you'd be able to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. We did this this mental health training, and we've tried to share it with our teams as well as, you know, there is so if you're running and you fall, and there's a variety of things that can happen. You roll your ankle and you fall. And one is you have to kind of hobble home and ice your ankle. And that's, you know, the first level. And then there's, well, maybe you should probably elevate it, stay off it for a couple of days. And then there's, well, maybe I'll get some crutches because I probably stay off for a few weeks. And then there's, I'm in surgery and having a reconstruction. And so that's where I was talking a little bit about, you know, mental health, mental wellness is not necessarily this dichotomy of well and unwell. It's a gradation of I'm good, oh, I'm not really that great, and then, you know, a gradual or can be acute decline. One of the things, and so you respond based on appropriately what's happening. And for some, that's a day, you know, that's a mental health day. That's a refocusing on a project that gives you energy rather than takes it away, or that's mentoring because actually that feeds your soul. You know, there's a lot of different ways that have nothing to do with people going on leave or receiving even treatment, but that are just to help with mental health. One of the things that came out of that training, which I thought was very interesting, was no matter where you are, from you didn't fall to your icing to you're in surgery having a reconstruction, a wellness plan is a great idea. And so, you know, you take a look at this wellness plan, and so I know if I'm in, they give colors to it, as people love colors. If I'm green and everything's fine, then my wellness plan is to make sure I eat right and get decent sleep and maybe exercise a couple of times a week. But I know if I'm declining into yellow or orange, then I need to do X and Y and Z. And so it's, you're not trying to figure out how to help yourself while you're in red or while you're in orange. You kind of have a plan together, and you can kind of moderate and adjust as you're sliding up and down that scale.
I think one thing that I really love about that analogy too is that if you're running and you roll your ankle, but you keep running, your ankle injury is going to get worse. And I think as opposed to taking a few days off, and I think the same thing's happening with mental health. You know, if people can take preventative measures or notice earlier on, you know, this is happening, I think I need to take a break. Often you don't get to that point where everything's really bad. Yeah, no, all great points. So now, if this is the last question that I have before we open it up to the questions from the audience, what resources currently exist to support others through mental health struggles, and what are ways in which we can improve these? So before I hand it off to Laura, I will say as well, just a reminder that there is a list of some resources that we found in the chat, should anyone be looking for more. But Laura, take it away.
Thanks. So we do have an EAP. That's kind of the umbrella for everybody. So about 4,000 employees to make sure that everybody has access to some mental health supports. And I think what's also nice about that EAP is it's not only for mental health, but sometimes stress is coming from other areas of our lives, right? So there is financial advice as part of that, or there's legal advice as part of that. So even if your stress is not work related or it's not a mental health condition, but it's building in you and you need some help, there's a variety of kinds of help there. Another thing we have done is, you know, I spoke a little bit at the beginning about sometimes, you know, and I certainly heard what Allison was saying about the nature of engineering work. Sometimes is maybe not as much talking about your feelings as we do in the social sciences, but is training our managers so that when people do come to them and they do have those concerns, we are trying to give our people managers or kind of influencers and leaders. They may not necessarily be people managers, but they have influence over others, or they're trusted by others, is giving them some mental health first aid training so that when people do come to them, they don't feel lost. They have some help that they can provide, and certainly make sure they're getting to the right people. I think we spoke a little bit, maybe all of us, about this idea of making yourself vulnerable as a leader, so that you can show others that you can be successful in this company and need help with your mental health. Those are not two separate and distinct things. And then for us, it just happened today, but anyways, we just signed on a new mental health specialist and to work who will, her job will be focused on supporting the mental health of all our employees. Just make sure people can come to work and be their best.
That's amazing. Herman or Allison, do you have anything to add? Yes, Herman, we can start with you.
Well, I actually think Laura has covered up like pretty much pretty extensively, like what type of typical help there is, right? So I think in most of the workplace or in school, they have similar type of support. And I think, yeah, that's what people should take advantage of if that's what that's something that they haven't been considering before. I think that's good to think about.
Yeah, I think one of the barriers in general to people accessing reports is just knowing resources, is just knowing that they exist. So creating more awareness is definitely another way. Allison?
Yeah, creating awareness, talking about it when it's good, and maybe also talking about it when it's bad. Like, you know, I think my generation talks about how you have to go therapist shopping. So, you know, if you go to your first therapist appointment and it's really uncomfortable, it might just be the fit of you. It's like going to see your doctor. You and the therapist might not be a good fit, and you should try other ones, for example. Hopefully we can sort of normalize these things a little more. And then for me, as I mentioned, like kind of the realization that I was a role model for so many students each year, and that especially, you know, young people are in a vulnerable position when it comes to mental health, like historically. I wanted to sort of make sense of the fact that I'm not a mental health expert, but I'm kind of a frontline person. So as you alluded to earlier, Shivani, I did this training that's called Identify, Assist, Refer, and it's pretty simple, and you can even Google it, and some universities have put it online. But essentially, it's a reminder to you that you can, you know, maybe look for signs among your students, in my case, of what someone who's struggling might look like. You can talk to them. It's not like, it kind of normalizes that act, which can be really scary to sort of break that ice initially. You feel like you're invading someone's privacy, for example, or it's none of your business. So it kind of helps you just get used to that. And then the third step is the important one, which is to refer to the expert. So it's not your burden, although of course you can support, but you know the resources and you can help the student get to those resources. So for me, that's been really helpful to kind of think in that framework. And then another thing, sort of just to switch gears really strongly, that we didn't get to talk about, I think, is this idea of sort of making a discussion about yourself part of your everyday work. So at the University of Toronto, I'm part of a special program called iLead, which is engineering leadership. And every meeting you have with them, whether it's like supposed to be the most productive meeting in the world or a fun lunch and learn, usually starts with a check-in where we go around the room and everyone says, you know, how they're doing and what they're bringing into the meeting. And doing it every time really does start to establish this sense of trust, where people will just give you a real sense of like, you know, I'm actually really distracted today because of X or Y. And you start to see people in not their work mode. And so maybe that can also help you check in on your colleagues and have a sense of when maybe they need that little extra private check-in.
Well, and I love that, because then you get to present as the full human, not like the working kind of robot who never has a problem and is always productive.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
I think just jumping on one of your earlier points, Allison, the therapist shopping, I think another resource that exists for a lot of employers is their employee insurance. So there are health benefits that they can use for seeing a therapist if maybe the EAP program they don't click with that person. But one of the barriers that I've kind of run into there is that some of the plans have very limited scopes in terms of who they cover. So they may only cover registered psychotherapists, but in Ontario, 5 different colleges can perform psychotherapy, including social workers and nurses. So I think that's one resource that people should really take advantage of, but then also employers expanding that to including like social workers and other people, because it's very hard to get an appointment with a psychotherapist, but it might be a lot easier for someone to get an appointment with a social worker, and especially with COVID and everyone trying to go get more support. So with that, I'll turn it to the audience questions. Do you think that mental health leaves will ever become normalized? It seems like a drastic step in today's society, even if it may be necessary. Does anyone want to jump in on that?
You know, I think it depends where you work sometimes. Like coming out of the federal government, it's pretty close to there. You know, I have two friends of two friends who work in the federal government who both took mental health leaves, and you know, one was a bit longer. They brought someone in to act for her so that her, you know, because sometimes the worry is your work is just there piling up for when you return. So I do have hope that we will continue, as we continue to have conversations like this, and conversations are in our respective either institutions or organizations, that it will become like a medical leave, because that's what it is. It's a medical leave, right? And that's it's frankly nobody's business what kind of medical leave it is. But I think if people want to share, then I need a medical leave for 3 months, and I'm going to manage myself so that I can come back and be my best self again.
I just wanted to point out that Patrick Murray had said in the chat, you know, the fear of the job not being there, no matter why the leave, could be very real for a lot of people. And so that's also included for things like illness and maternity. And I think that's a good point as well. That I don't think mental health leaves will be normalized until other leaves are as well, to a certain extent.
Yeah, and you know, it's tricky because you know, legislatively it's protected. That's a very blunt instrument especially if an employer wants to be a bad employer, it's very easy for them to do so, and it's very difficult for the employee to fight their way back.
For sure. Okay, the next question. Aside from regular meetings with your staff, what other mechanisms exist to understand your employees' mental health? Should we include mental health focused questions into employee satisfaction surveys? Herman or Allison, do either of you want to jump on that?
Yeah, I mean, for like a more formal type of assessment, definitely like employee satisfaction survey and things like that would give you certain clues, right? About how, in general, how the team is doing, how the organization, everybody in the organization is doing, what has been impacting them, right? So that, I think that's important. But I think to me, what makes the most difference is just to be, you know, I think both Allison and Laura mentioned it earlier, is just to present each other to be not just the worker in the organization. It's throughout everyday interaction to make sure that we are human first, right? We don't have to be each other's best friends, but you know, we're taking interest into how other people are doing in their life before we get into, you know, necessarily the productive business all the time. I think that to me, that makes the most difference. It doesn't need to be formal meetings to sit down and just be like, to try and figure out like how you're doing in general. But and obviously, like, everybody working from home for the most part last year and this year has deterred a lot of these things, and I think that's part of what's suffering it, right? But I think when that slowly comes back and we make more deliberate effort in doing that, it certainly helps.
I think one thing that you had mentioned there as well is that, you know, you really need to walk the talk. Like, it doesn't make sense as an organization to say, oh, we care about mental health, but then, you know, be very blunt with your direct reports and not show any caring there as well. So I think, as you mentioned, it's on both sides of the spectrum. Allison, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think, so I think you can, I think setting aside time to talk about it, to check in on people, which is really intentionally not the last 2 minutes of a meeting, I think says a lot. And I think that you should also be persistent. So, you know, we are, I think, culturally like raised to say like, yeah, I'm fine, I'm okay. Like, it's almost like hitting our knee at the doctor, like that's the response. And I think honestly, like sometimes that's the response I'm looking for from my students, or it used to be. I don't want to have a big conversation, and so I would just let that go. But now, as I've kind of like realized more and more, if you give that question a little bit of space and time and persistence, you can have more faith in what you're hearing. And so actually, like one of our co-organizers, Manraj, mentioned one of his colleagues, I think, asks the question in a way that gets to more than just like, how are you? Maybe it's, how are you feeling? I forget, maybe Manraj can drop it in the chat. But just taking time out of what should be productive time, I think signals to your workers that you really do care.
And I think, as Laura mentioned, it is in the employer's best interest too, because happier and healthier employees are more productive, which people don't always realize. Building off of your response, Allison, I was wondering if you can start with this question, which is, how do you build that trust within your team? So many of these things are very private and uncomfortable for employees to disclose. How do we deal with that?
Yeah. And I don't have the golden answer to that, I think. But what I do know is that like trust on a team is just hugely important for a productive, happy team. And so it's something I think we should all be trying to build. I guess we've said it already, but being vulnerable yourself, I think builds trust. I think following up on things builds trust too. Like it's, but also setting expectations of what is going to stay within the team, and maybe there are some things that actually will be escalated elsewhere, for example, or where you'll want to refer to someone else would be really important. Those are my quick ideas on that. Good question.
I heard a really good quote the other day that said, every relationship is just a series of interactions. So building trust, I think, is just, making sure you have, as you mentioned, that consistency in all the different interactions. Herman and Laura, anything to add on that?
I think, other than showing vulnerability, and another way to show by example is also making sure your team is not seeing you violating trust of other people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can't be, just be telling other people and other team members issues, because that implicitly or explicitly actually tell them that they can't trust you as well. So just, you need to treat this situation with the correct respect, right? And there's no shortcut to build trust. It's to put your actual best intention to it. And it's not just important to trust your team, it's actually critical. That everything functions relies on trusting your team, and that's how everybody accomplish things together as an organization, as a group, right?
Great. Laura, did you want to add anything before I move on?
I might just quickly add, I think when you are building trust, the language matters a lot. And so how you talk about others who might be struggling is going to tell your team exactly what they need to know about what your attitude is going to be like if they came to you. I think always leading with compassion and empathy, people can tell if that's sincere or not. As long as it's sincere, and you say what you do what you say what you're gonna do, then you will start to build trust. And I think also being explicit about it, and so I have a team that I manage, and my job as the leader of that team is to remove obstacles and help them navigate obstacles. Those can be professional ones, or those can be ones that are happening inside of them. And so sincerely saying, I want to help you if you need this kind of help, and I can get you so far, and then I can help you to get beyond. But I take that seriously as part of my job, and sometimes just saying it.
Oh, and I think the normalization and also modeling the behavior, as all of you mentioned too, just, if you are taking a mental health day as a leader, saying, I'm taking a mental health day, or I have a migraine today, I'm going to like, being transparent with your employees allows them to feel more comfortable and do the same with you, I think. How do you recommend managing perceptions of your mental health? For example, people assume you're fine, but you're not. Does anyone want to jump in on that one?
This is someone, or I guess we don't know who it is, and we can't really clarify this question, but if this is you right now, people assume you are fine, but you are not. I would really encourage you to not worry so much about people's perceptions and to go get the help that you need. I think maybe it feels like a big disclosure that people might be really surprised that you seem like you're doing great, but you're not. But I actually think that that surprise will be a lot less than you think it is. And everybody, when people realize that perception is off, they'll think like, oh yeah, that makes sense, because anonymous attendee is human too. So yeah, I would say don't let that get in the way of you going to seek the help that you need, and find times to have conversations with people that you trust.
I think the people that you trust part is really important, because I think you don't need to necessarily say to everyone, you know, hey world, this is what I'm going through. I mean, you can if you want to, and if you're a leader, that does have an impact on people because you're a role model. But I think just being open with someone that you trust. If you're a manager, if you have a one-on-one with your manager, like I had a death in my family 2 months ago. And so during my one-on-one with my manager, I was kind of like, you know, here's my situation. I think it's helpful as well for the people you're working with, because then, as Allison said, they can give context to what you're doing. So if your performance is maybe off for a little bit, people can understand why, and then they don't think, you know, it's usual. They just might think, you know, they need space or whatever. So I think that, as you said, it's really important, like get the help that you need and take that first step, and don't feel like you need to tell the world, because it is a private thing for a lot of people, but tell those that you trust, I would say. Herman or Laura, anything to add on that one?
No, great advice.
No? Okay. How do we recover from the impacts COVID had on everyone's mental wellness? And Laura, I think I'm going to start with you, because I feel like this is something that you've been having to think about with your role. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Just this tiny question that's very easy to answer. You know, I honestly, not to be trite, I like the way we deal with every major massive thing is just one piece at a time. And so as we look around to see how are we going to recover from this, I mean, there's financial recovery, there's returning to the office. What does that look like? There's, you know, we have team members who've been working for a year together and never actually met each other in the human form. The way we travel has changed fundamentally. So I think the way that we are trying to do it is constantly checking in with our employee population. We survey a lot. We have a bit of survey fatigue, and I understand that, but we want to be guided by what our employees want and need. As we start, you know, we're not quite at the recovery period. We're still kind of in the thick of it. But understanding where our employees are at, where they want to get, and then how we're going to be able to walk them on that path is really, because I think if you start to think about end state, it gets a bit overwhelming.
Yeah.
And like, I don't know how we're going to get there, but we can do little bites. We can do little bites, and we can constantly check in and make sure that we're on a path that's going to support our people.
That's a really good point. Herman, did you want to add something?
I think one thing that like often helps me is to think about like it's not necessarily like sure, the mental health recovery is important. But it's not thinking about how the world is going to recover to the way it was. It might not need to be. It's just a progression. It's just a big experiment of change management, actually, for the whole world. It's like, and the thing about change management is to know that, you know, it could be worse before it can get better. Is always to have that thought of like, to recognizing where you are on dealing with the change. And I think that certainly, you know, takes a lot of pressure away from yourself to like, how do I get back to how it was before? It doesn't need to go back to how it was before. It is an evolution of how the world is, how the society is. You know, like Laura talked about how we travel might change forever, you know, but that's okay. That's what my advice would be. And that's what that's how I deal with it, I should say, you know.
Yeah, and I'll add to that and just say, I think especially if you're a leader, I recommend you try to take a generous approach when we're going back to in person, and sort of question like what really matters about the way we used to do things. Like, for example, this whole year, because of COVID, I didn't enforce any late penalties on any student assignment. Don't tell them this happened. You know what? The averages were the same as usual. Like, it's not that big of a deal. So just yeah, try to be kind. I think it is going to be hard in many ways, as it's been hard already, but it's also hard to predict what it's going to be like, for sure.
Yeah, the word that came to mind was flexible, right? Because I think everyone's at a different point. Right now, you know, the public health group in my area talks about we're not all in the same boat, but we're weathering the same storm, and so all these boats look very different, right? And having lots of compassion for the different situations that people find themselves in, and how they're gonna come back. So making sure that we're supporting them from where they are.
I think one thing that I just add is to make sure that we're giving space, like Allison, as you said, being kind, and then also make sure that we're giving space for ourselves and others to actually feel these emotions. Because I think, Allison, you mentioned earlier that, you know, as leaders, sometimes we just put everything that we need to, all the emotions we're dealing with, put them in the box, and we're like, we'll deal with this later. That later is now. And so we really need to start, you know, processing all of our emotions, the grief, the anxiety, everything that we've kind of felt over this year, because if that's not dealt with, it builds. And so I think it's really important that we, and also everyone around us, we encourage people to sit with those feelings and process them. Yeah. The last question is from Amanda, and it's for Laura. Has your organization always been on the forefront of supporting mental health needs of employees? And if not, how did you push them towards expanding programs, training, and benefits?
I will start with saying I'm not sure. I've only been there 4 years, but I would hazard a guess that not necessarily. I think the way that we have put it on the forefront is that it's actually a business imperative. We talk often about, like, we are a construction business. We build things. We build really awesome things. But the way we build them is with people. And so we are actually, in essence, a people business. And if our people are suffering, if our people can't be what we need them to be, then that has a bottom line implication. And so it's not this HR, or I work very closely with a leader in health and safety. We do this jointly together. It's not, oh, that's just HR and health and safety talking about, you know, people and their feelings again. It's like, if we want to make some money, and we do want to make some money, we need our people to be at their best. And if they're not, we need to be supporting them to get back there. So it's a bit of a, you know, it's coming from a place of kindness, but leading to a place of business reality, I would say, is probably how we've had the most. Plus, we have a really compassionate leader who cares deeply about his entire organization. And I think, you know, that's not always the case. It's not always been the case in the organizations for which I've worked, but it is the case here. Kind of the magic recipe to help the business thing.
Yeah, no, that's great. We have 5 minutes left. So what I'll do is I'll just hand it off to each of you if there's any closing thoughts you had or anything else that you wanted to say. Laura, I'll start with you since you just had the mic.
Okay. Thank you. I don't think so. I do appreciate, and I am just delighted that people are talking about this more and more, because I think that's actually how we're going to get to where we need to get, is just having constant conversations, normalizing it, and encouraging it. In fact, beyond normalizing, but encouraging people to get help that is going to make a difference in their lives. So thank you for listening.
Thank you. Herman.
Yeah, in terms of yeah, similarly, like, I just want to, you know, thanks for the opportunity. And I think having this kind of conversation, one conversation at a time, is what helps normalizing it. And so I'm incredibly grateful for this opportunity. Even though, you know, part of showing the vulnerability is to come in and say, I'm not an expert, but I'm happy to talk about it. And hopefully this, you know, helps anybody in the audience to, with their mindset a little bit, to, you know, if it makes any difference at all, that'll be great as well. So thanks for the opportunity, and then I truly enjoyed it.
I just wanted to pick up on one thing that you said, Herman, which was, having the conversations, even though we're not experts. And I think right now, especially, a lot of people are scared to talk about things because they're scared of getting it wrong. And I think it's really important to just, start talking. Make sure if you make a mistake, apologize and move forward and learn from it, but just start having these conversations, because if we wait until we know everything, we're never going to have the conversation. Allison, I'll hand it to you.
Yeah. Well, also, Shivani, the last question that was asked to Laura, I think it'd be interesting to hear, since you did advocate at U of T for expanding programs. If we have a minute, maybe it'd be cool to hear what you have to say. And maybe as the last word for me, I think we talked about this as a panel and maybe we forgot to do it today, just to challenge everyone here to have one of these vulnerable conversations. Pick someone at work each week and just ask, how are you doing, in a way that doesn't let them dodge your question. And also maybe ask your boss, what are we doing? As an organization, can we expand our support of mental health? Because I think talking about it more is going to help, and asking for it more will help. So yeah, thanks. Glad to be here participating. If you're a student at U of T, I'll put in the chat where we have some resources. And then, yeah, Shivani, I'd love to end with you.
Yeah. So in terms of pushing them towards expanding programs, trainings, and benefits, I think, as Laura said, in one sense of it, it just makes business sense. For school, it's not necessarily business sense, but it still just makes sense. You want healthier students so you don't have bad press about things, or you want your students to do better and perform better in terms of research and rankings and all that stuff. So I think part of it is just, talking about what the consequences of the bad mental health are and those effects. I think another part of it is just getting a pulse on where people are, because someone asked about surveys. If you don't have the facts, people are going to dance around the subject and say, I don't really think that's how people feel. So when I was part of the student government, we did a lot of surveys to find out, exactly how are students feeling and what are the barriers that they're facing, because people will listen to you a lot more if you have the facts. And if you say, this is what's happening, they can't ignore it anymore. So I think it's really important to make a business case, talk about what's actually happening on the ground and what the effects of those things happening are. And then also, anytime someone brings up a problem, if you go to them with the solution, that also helps. So in terms of benefits, saying we may need less travel coverage because people are traveling less, and we can put some of that money towards therapy coverage. Like, that's coming up with concrete ways that the people on the other side don't have to think. They can just take your solution and implement it. I would say that. But yeah, thank you for asking me the question, Allison. And thank you to all of our panelists. The discussion has been wonderful, and it's been a joy talking to you all. Thank you, audience, for sticking with us and listening, and have a great evening, everyone. Take care.